Hi there. Welcome to, I don't even know what week this is. Welcome to it. This week we're talking about chapters 8 and 9. Different modes of observation, quantitative and qualitative. And we're concentrating on experiments and survey research in 8 and 9. And then the next few weeks we talk about qualitative field research and on and on and on. So this is sort of your introduction to the different ways that you can observe a phenomena, collect your data, those kinds of things. And so in the book, it spends a lot of time giving you some good information on what kind of topics are appropriate to use for experiments and what would lend themselves, maybe not lend themselves so easily to that type of inquiry. And then your book kind of lays out for you classical experiments, talks about independent and dependent variables, just all kinds of different forms that a method or a procedure for a study might take, like pre-test, post-test, using experimental and control groups, the double-blind experiment, which we don't often, well, you might see that in social sciences. It's most common in medical research, biological research, where we're trying to test the clinical trials of medicines and drugs and protocols for treatment, things like that, where we might see a double-blind type of study. They're not as common in the social sciences, but they're important to know about and read about and understand because you may run across them at some point. The book talks about subject selection, in terms of whether to use randomization or matching. It's interesting that I want you to keep in mind, as you're reading all these different descriptions, some ethical dilemmas that might come into play with social science research, doing randomization or matching or double-blind experiments or blind experiments, what have you. Because when we're dealing with the types of variables that we deal with and dealing with human participants, we have to be very careful that we are being ethical in the plan we have for our study. In everything that we do, the way we select our participants, our sample, and then what we do with them once we get them. For example, you wouldn't be able to see true experimental studies in many aspects of social sciences because it would be unethical to hold back certain interventions from certain populations just in order to see if one works and one doesn't. So keep that in mind as you're reading that. The ethics that we talked about at the beginning of the semester continue to play an important role throughout the entire study. And I know I've said that before, but I want you to continue to keep that in mind because it's something that a researcher should always be paying attention to. And it's something that you should be paying attention to as you read research and try to critically evaluate it. So your book does talk about some variations on experimental design that are there as necessity because we have to rely on those sometimes in our work in the social sciences. Something I want to call your attention to that's very important, especially for critiquing articles, which you're going to have to do, are validity issues that we might have in experimental research. Now, we've talked about reliability and validity in terms of measurement already, and hopefully you have a good grasp of those concepts and what they mean, because now you're looking at threats to the validity of the study itself. So validity and reliability doesn't end at the measurement phase. It follows all the way through the study too, which is another place that you can critically evaluate literature that you read, but it's also an important thing to keep in mind as you plan your own. So your book starts to get you thinking in those lines, talking about threats to internal validity, and it has just lists: history, maturation, testing, instrumentation, so that you know when you're in the book what I'm talking about, what to be paying special attention to. I really want you to pay close attention to that. And then the book talks also about threats to external validity, which I also want you to pay close attention to, because whenever we're reading someone else's research findings, we're thinking about all these things, not only reliability and validity of the measurement, not only the sample size, sample makeup, sample demographics, we're also looking at things that might have been threats to the validity of the study itself in terms of the way they selected their sample, in terms of the way they conducted their testing, the procedures that they engaged in. And your book talks about different things related to external validity as well, and ways to sort of address the issue. So I call special attention to you to that. And it also talks about different types of, like I said, variations on the typical experience. And it gives you strengths and weaknesses of the experimental method. Very important for you to be aware of. Many of you might think that you already know what kind of researcher you are. A lot of times I get people say, well, I don't really need to understand all this stuff about quantitative because I'm a qualitative researcher. Or conversely, I don't need to understand qualitative because, I'm quantitative. And I say to that, well, everybody, of course, has their preference, and that's okay. I have a preference myself. But remember that what drives the methodology is the question that you're asking, not the person conducting the research. So you don't say, well, I would never be able to do that because I'm qualitative. You absolutely could do something quantitative if that's the kind of question you need answered. And you need to be aware of how to do those things. It's also important when you're reading research, even if you primarily do qualitative work because those are the kinds of questions that intuitively interest you, you still have to know how to read quantitative research and evaluate it critically. So pay attention to all of this material, whether it's talking about quantitative or qualitative as we go through the semester. Both are important to know about, and both are valuable, and you need to be able to be a critical consumer of both. Okay, that's my soapbox. So your book gives you some strengths and weaknesses of the experimental method that I want to call your attention to, and it also covers a little bit about ethics. But I want you to be thinking about ethics at every stage, at every step, in everything that you're reading, because it definitely plays into the research design and plan. And then Chapter 9 talks about survey research, which is a very common form of research that a lot of people use. A lot of the studies that you'll be reading about for this class and others will have used it. So it's a really good idea to get yourself really familiar with topics that are appropriate for survey research, with some guidelines that might be necessary for asking the questions. Because even in that, I've read some really well-done studies where their procedures are great, their sample selection is wonderful. The measures, wow, they look good, but then when I actually see the questionnaire, the questions, I have a problem with. Maybe they're too close-ended, or maybe they're too open-ended, or maybe they have a bias inherent in them, which kind of leads a person towards a certain answer that may not necessarily be the answer they would have chosen had they not been steered that way. So, look at things like that. You also have to make sure a lot of times, for example, whenever I'm doing a survey, I always put the income information at the very end, because those are questions people might not be willing to answer. And there's lots of questions out there that people might not be willing to answer, and you need to be cognizant of those and have a plan for that. I put my income stuff at the end because I really want the data. And if I have missing data on income, well, I can leave income out of my analyses as long as I haven't tied myself too tightly to those hypotheses, to that variable as a hypothesis. But if they get mad at the first question where I ask them their income, they're not going to fill out the rest of the survey. So there's lots of things that go into thinking about how you're going to format your study, how you're going to order your questions, what questions you'll ask. You need to work on wording. If you're doing a survey of teen parents who are maybe average age 13, you don't want to be asking questions that are worded in a way that they can't understand them. You want to be on their reading level. So lots of things you have to make sure that they're competent to answer mentally, emotionally. Some of the research we do can be very emotion inciting, I guess you could say. And so we want to make sure the questions we ask they're able to answer emotionally as well as cognitively. And that the questions are relevant. And so, again, it goes through all these, all these different things. Talks about avoiding bias in your items and terms. Very important. You'd be astounded at some of the surveys that I've seen that are just like, well, it does such a judgmental wording in there. You've got to change that. And it gets into questionnaire construction a little bit. How to order the items, the pre-test, self-administration. how to monitor returns and response rates, talks about case studies, interview surveys, the role of the survey interviewer, guidelines for interviewing. Very important that you understand what those guidelines are. Because if you're ever going to be interviewing using a survey instrument but in person in an interview form, you want to make sure that you are aware of some of the important things about your demeanor when asking those questions. Same with telephone surveys. Talks about computer-assisted and online surveys, which are growing in popularity. So a lot of you will be very interested in reading that part. And then it gives you comparisons of the different methods and some strengths and weaknesses of survey research. Very important for you to be aware of, because you're going to be coming across a lot of studies in your literature searches that use survey research. And you're going to be critically evaluating them. So you want to make sure you understand all these terms. It also talks about secondary analysis, which is a very pretty common method as well. I have been working a little bit with the Fragile Families data set, which is a nationally representative sample of non-custodial low-income fathers. And that's research, that's data that was collected by others through a huge funding mechanism nationwide, very labor-intensive. I could never replicate that myself with the resources I currently have, but I have this data set that's there for the public to use that I can go in and it asks questions that are of the variables there are of interest to me, and so there's things I can do with that. And that's a very viable method too, but it's important that I know, if I'm going to use that data, what their measures were, what their procedure was, how they got their data, and those kinds of things before I want to use it. So that part of the chapter will probably be very helpful for many of you as well. It's a great option for a thesis student. I have a couple of thesis students working on their projects using secondary data. So it's a nice way to have data there available to you. Saves you the time of collecting it yourself if there's one that's appropriate and applicable to the topic you want to study. So that's kind of what you're going to be looking at this week. Like I said, I want you to, and every week I want you to read it and then read it again and then read it again and keep reading it until you almost know what's going to come next. This is all sort of just the basic building blocks of research. It's so important for you to know to critically evaluate it, as well, of course, to go out and do your own. I want to see evidence of all of this information coming through in the proposals when I read them, as well as in those article critiques as I read them, as well as in the research cafes, for goodness sakes, if you choose to use that route, to go that route of the critique in the research cafe. So if you have questions as we get more into these more technical aspects of the class, of the content, please feel free to get on that Q&A board and ask for either a written question or a video answer. I'm happy to do either one. Let us know how you're doing. I can't look out at you and see faces that are like, oh, I got this, or faces that are going, what is she even talking about? So I can't tell how well you're getting it without being able to see you. So please let me know. Give me feedback. Let me know how you're doing and how you're coming along with understanding the material. So good luck to you this week. I'll see you online.